we join the rest of the world in observing the commemoration of International Biodiversity Day here in St. Lucia, we do so with mixed feelings. On one hand, we do so with great concern that our planet is experiencing unprecedented levels of biodiversity loss. It was agreed at the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity through ambitious global biodiversity framework that urgent action is needed if we are to reverse these trends. Urgent action that will reverse the negative trends and put us on a path to live in harmony with nature by 2050. For this to be achieved, a whole of society approach with all sectors, groups, and individuals playing their part as necessary. This year's theme for International Biodiversity Day 2023 is From Agreement to Action, Build Back Biodiversity. This emphasizes the need for collaborative and concrete actions if we are to reach our 2050 goal. As a country with limited resources, we recognize that biodiversity loss is a problem, and it is time to be strategic in our effort to turn our agreements into transformative action that are inclusive, equitable, and just if the future generation are to enjoy the benefits of biodiversity. St. Lucia is committed to ensuring that our biodiversity is conserved and sustained, and that our people have access to the natural resources and traditional knowledge that may become that we can benefit from. On the other hand, today we commemorate the International Biodiversity Day. We take the time to recognize and celebrate Anita James for her contribution to biodiversity education in St. Lucia. Anita was a champion in her field, and her impact was felt locally, regionally, and globally. Let us in our own way reaffirm our commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Let us find ways to enhance or support each other as institutions, communities, and individuals as we strive to achieve this goal. Biodiversity plays an important role in our lives, and without it, life as we know it would not be the same. We are grateful for your presence here this evening in this inaugural memorial lecture, and we look forward to the other activities that will continue to celebrate the life and effort of Miss Anita James. I thank you.
Thank you so very much for sharing with us those remarks, Mrs. Montoute. And indeed, Mrs. Anita James was a steward, a stalwart of the sustainable development community, and we certainly are very pleased to recognize her here this evening. A very close friend of hers, no doubt, and a person who may have shared quite a lot of memories of her is none other than Mr. Laurent Japierre, and he, of course, has a presentation to make today, this evening, on the economics of ethnobotany in St. Lucia. And of course, Mr. Japierre is not just an academic, he's a very practical individual. He is on the ground, he roams St. Lucia, he is a very hands-on individual. And of course, he has brought quite an interesting display, no doubt, to share with us this evening. And he's only allotted 20 minutes, so I'm going to say nothing more because I suspect he may very well push us over the limit. Mr. Laurent Japierre.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Calix Jr., for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I'm delighted to be here. Makota Moesia, Oswea, C2 pour célébrer Madame Anita James. Moi, bien content. Nous lever quand maman ensemble et il était grand cessé pour moi. Anita was like a big sister to me. And I'm thankful to the organizers of this event tonight for putting this together and in honor of Anita James, but kind of a tribute to Anita, her legacy. She lived and breathed biodiversity. The depth of her dedication to biodiversity, her selflessness, her discipline. Anita was a special person, a special sister. She was selfless. I remember going all around the island when we were looking at parks and protected areas under the auspices of the St. Lucia National Trust, in the days of Robert DeVoe and Giles Romulus, who was the engine at the time. And we spent long nights coming back home, sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning, spreading the biodiversity gospel, as it were. And she was always a deep thinker, a giant in her own right. And I must say, as I've said before, she was the first person who invited me to a secondary school to give a lecture to her students in Soufrière. And I run into these students now, they have more beard than I have now, and they say, "Sir, you taught me." And I go, "But I don't know you all." But it was Anita's modus operandi. She gave, Anita sent, she looked around to see who she could push in certain positions and directions to create a broad net of the whole biodiversity ethos. And I remember she invited the FRC, members of the FRC, Folk Research Center, when she realized that part of biodiversity belonged to the FRC. And we have people sitting in the audience here tonight in who she invited from the FRC to represent St. Lucia. Et partit à point tout. She spread the love. Very selfless. And kudos to her. She was, in my mind, a giant gourmet have fallen in the St. Lucian forest. A giant gourmet, an endangered species she was. And in my mind, she made a noise. She made a noise. And, you know, Anita was special. I really want to stress that. You know, her discipline, her love. She chastised you when she had to. You know, but that was Anita. What you see is what you get, you know. And, but like anything else, when the giant tree falls in the forest, that's how the light gets in. It makes space for seedlings, the understory, as Donald would always say, and my forestry friends, it makes way for the seedlings to grow out of the space where the light gets in. So I'm not afraid. She's opened a huge gap so that younger people and others can grow, and biodiversity will continue to be alive and well, and we find people who are dedicated and would continue her legacy. And I want to thank you all for this event tonight. It tells me we are maturing and we are celebrating ourselves, our people, and we are building institutions. It's not a large-digit society. We are building an institution, and we are building our own people. Anita James Memorial Lecture. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. But anyway, for the business why I'm here tonight, I just thought I should I should share that. I know I'm passionate about that. Anita was a special, special sister. You know, she wasn't critical unnecessarily. She gave you her sticks when she had to give you, but it's bon. It's bon. Biodiversity is huge. It's in her legacy. As I've said, we've done a lot. She guided without control. She guided you, but she never tried to control you. She was part of the Parks and Protected Areas project under the auspices of the National Trust, and she was an inspiration. But today I want to segue into why I'm here and to speak about the economics of biodiversity. And very briefly, biodiversity is life. Plants are the most ubiquitous object or living organism in the world. It's everywhere. Without plants, we die. Plants provide so much for us. The basic thing, it takes in carbon monoxide and it gives out oxygen. Without oxygen, we die. That's what we take in. So it's important for us to have plants. Plants is life, like the forest. Without the forest, we haven't got life. Bottom line, and as Donald would always say, it traps the rain. Without the forest, we have no water. And why? Why no forest, no water? And that's I learned from my colleagues like Donald and Forrester. The trees act as a sponge. That's Donald's lyrics, as a sponge, and it traps the water. And it releases it gradually into the streams and the rivers so that we could have water. So trees are important not only for food, for shelter, but for the basic needs of existence. Without trees, we die. We would not have water. And that is why I celebrate tonight in the same breath the legacy of the great Coco Charles, the father of conservation in this country. And without him, we would probably have very little forest. We would not have parrots. And to me, he's one of the greatest St. Lucians who have trod this land in my dispensation, in my time of existence. And so I brought a whole lot of things there just to give you an idea of the importance of plants in our everyday lives. First, let me begin by saying that's where and without taxonomy, we would be completely cuckoo. Man or humans instinctively taxonomize. Because if I tell you, for example, Aipwe Zeblabamwe, which one? You got to be specific. If not, we would have a Tower of Babel, a whole lot of confusion. That's why we need to be specific. That's why we taxonomize. That's why we name things. Or it will be totally clear. According to the sacred text, the Bible, it says Adam was the first taxonomist. In Genesis, I think it was 1:19 or 2:19. 2:19. God brought Adam after he had created all things to give them names according to the Holy Writ. So Adam was the first taxonomist, and that's why we taxonomists look at Jose Nenu. We believe it begins and ends with us, because even if you have good chemistry, good research, but you have no idea which plant you researched on, your research becomes null and void. So it's important to know on which plant you are actually doing research. And so it's important that with human beings, because of the importance of naming things, we instinctively taxonomize. If not, it will be complete chaos. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we have a binominal system in taxonomy. We call things by name so that we could communicate. And that is why I brought that bunch of grass. And if I say, go and take the plant for me to make the tea, you could bring any plant. Sometimes it's a plant that will scratch your throat. But if you are specific and you say, go get Kossol leaves, then you know exactly what you're going for. And if you bring something else, your mom or your dad would say, this is not Kossol. So it's important that we name things. And that is why taxonomists, we are very puffed up about ourselves, because we say, without us, even if your science is perfect, you don't know what you're talking about. It's a language that we've put together. And not just at the binominal system in the scientific world, like genus and species, the local taxonomy and naming of plants is as important in the local sphere as in the international sphere. It's just the binominal structure, that is genus and species, that's the scientific names, as we call them, is only for the universal language, so that we could communicate with the entire world, So if I come in and I say I'm using go pompon, for example, nobody understands what I'm talking about. But because they are scientific names, Leonoptis nepitifolia, Leonoptis is the genus, nepitifolia is the species, then you know the universal conversation and discourse could take place. That's why we name plants, so that we could communicate. We know what we're talking about. We know whatever plant we are doing the research on, that it has a name, a scientific name that we could communicate worldwide. But in the domestic faith, do not poo-poo what's in the domestic faith. It is as important as in the international arena. So when say munadu bagay sa se kosol, it's important. It's gopopon, it is as important as our flora. Let me switch very quickly because I know time's running out. Our flora is divided into the introduced species and the indigenous species. And I've brought a number of plants here just to illustrate the use of plants in our everyday life. That is the economic benefits of plants. Plants are so important. They create wealth. They build wealth. They are very important not just for medicinal purposes, but they are important for wealth building. If you look around, presque tout bagay nou ka fait. Nous besoin un plan. Nous n'y pour servir un plan. Even a lily stick to lily our babawes. It's a plant. Lily, we know lily? I didn't bring one today, but lily. For dyes, for example. You have dyes where you could use it for coloring or for dyeing. You have calabash, which is our national tree. And in fact, we have our legends as well. In the Irish culture, they say, if you kiss the Blarney stone, you're blessed with the gift of the gab. But our tradition says, if you drink first from a calabash, you'll be blessed with the gift of the gab. Bukai pali jalap. You know, and this is part of our culture. This is part of our tradition. So don't think it's only the Irish that have about the gift of the gab. We have that too. We have games like Wowie, as I have on the floor. We have so many other plants that we use in our everyday life. And we use them medicinally. We use them for our healing. We use them for our entertainment. We use them for economically, how to make some money, how to heal ourselves. And so plants is huge, huge, huge in our lives. And we underestimate or we don't pay attention to the importance of plants in our lives. Musically, we make musical instruments, as you could see the flute up there. Shak, shak. In the arts and craft, we use plants. We use plants in so many, for brooming, for cleaning our homes, for hygiene. The Latanier palm in broom making is an economic plant. Even in the early times, we were already exporting brooms to Canada and other places around the world. People don't even know that. And during the Second World War, there was an outbreak of malaria in St. Lucia with the soldiers dying. And we had to revert to traditional knowledge because the boats could not come in to bring in, what's it called, what you use against malaria fever, the chemical we use. Quinine, thank you very much, quinine. And we had to revert to traditional knowledge. That's the importance of traditional knowledge. Do not poo-poo traditional knowledge. TK, that's what we call it in biodiversity. And the troops were dying, and they had to revert to traditional knowledge. And what they found, they went to the people, to the ancestral, that body of knowledge that we have created in our own lived experience as a people. They had to revert to that. And what they found, that they used to use a plant in the forest called China, named after St. Lucia, Exostema Santa Lucia in the scientific world. But we know it as China, found in the rainforest. Got the barks, boiled them, gave them to drink, and it saved the troops. So it was, and you know, it is in the same genus as the quinine found in South and Central America. Same genus. So they contain the same biochemistry, the same properties. And in fact, during the times of the explorers, of the early explorers in Latin America and so forth, quinine was worth its weight in gold. It was as important as gold during those days because malaria kills. And so we have quinine here in Exhaustima Santa Lucia. China is the local name. And there are so many examples that I could give tonight. But because of time, I'm just, how we've used our plants in our everyday, for entertainment, for food, for clothing, cotton, for shelter, thatch roofs, but most importantly for our very survival. We depend on plants, and plants depend on us. That interrelationship. We need to protect our environment. We need to take care of the plants around us. Our flora, as I've said earlier, is a mixture of introduced and indigenous. Mango is an introduced species. Mangifera indica, coming out of India. Tamarind is an introduced species coming out of Africa. There was a misnomer in its identification because when they brought things from the Caribbean and Latin America, the early explorers took it to the botanists. There were expeditions, and they collected. Barbados was one of the places they collected and brought all the specimens and then brought it to England for the Linnaeus and the great botanists during that period to describe and to taxonomize. And there were some misnomers because things happened. For example, a mango was from India, but tamarind was from Africa. And they named it they call it indica, after India, but that was a misnomer. And we've corrected that with more research in the field of botany and ethnobotany. And by the way, ethnobotany, people and plants, that's what it is. How people use their plants in their everyday lives, from the simple to the sublime. For music, which is sublime, and instruments of music, to the simple things of life. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to close by saying plants are important, and we need to do our very best to protect our forests, our plants, because plants give us wealth, it gives us health, and it's important for our very survival. Feel free to come and ask questions when I'm done, because I'm prepared to share with you all the specimens that I have here. But in brief, let us guard our species, especially our endemic species, understudied species. There's a lot of research that needs to be done, and we've started with TRAMIL, and I'll just end on this TRAMIL, Traditional Medicines of the Island. It's a group of scientists, ethnobotanists, botanists, biochemists around the Caribbean and Latin America. We meet every year or every 2 years to look at our research and to inspire each other and to continue the research on our medicinal plants. We're making a lot of strides, and it's made up of several people. Dr. Centros is part of that group. We look at it with scientific rigor. We don't just take the words we begin with the traditional knowledge, and we take the traditional knowledge to the laboratory so that we could expand and propound and research so that we could come out and authenticate what's happening in the scientific world and putting our traditional medicine on par. Like Zebapic and all of these plants during the pandemic, scientists in Guadeloupe studying plants, Dr. Henri Joseph came out with something from Norelia loblata, Zebapic, as a help in boosting your immune system so that you could be able to fight the pandemic. And many other research that's going on around the world. And I will have to stop here because I know I can go on and on.
At this time, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to be bringing on a panel. It's called a side chat, which is one of the innovations of this Anita James Memorial Lecture. So we're going to very kindly ask Mrs. Montoot and Dr. Fletcher to join the audience, and we're going to be inviting up to the panel, first the Chief Forestry Officer in St. Lucia, Mr. Alwyn Donnelly. He'll be joining us as well. Thank you. Mr. Jeremiah Edmond, the Sustainable Development and Environment Officer. And he's got special responsibility for biodiversity and biosafety. And he's a former classmate of mine, I should mention that as well. And also Mrs. Rebecca Rock, the Deputy Chief Forestry Officer. And of course, in this age of entrepreneurship, I'm not sure if we are going to be joined by Miss Anthea Joshua. Yes, she is with us. Wonderful.
When we first came off the press, we had hopes of someday helping to quench thirst, provide mobility, contain goodies, and bring smiles. And for the most part, we did. But look at us now. We've been tossed out of windows, thrown in gutters, dumped indiscriminately, causing you harm. Now, we languish in mangroves, blow in the wind, drift in huge patches, and sadly, some of our kind are responsible for the death of marine life. Look at us. All we wanted was to make your life easier and then be disposed of in a recycle bin. Now, we will take years to disintegrate. So please, don't send any more plastics to join us. Your future, your children's future, depends on a clean ocean.
Welcome back. And this is a side chat as part of this inaugural Anita James Memorial Lecture, where we're getting a chance to focus on St. Lucia and its interaction with these biodiversity conventions, which you may or may not have heard of, which effectively guide the entire world in how we engage with our biodiversity. And so once again, let me welcome Mr. Alwyn Donnelly, Mr. Jeremiah Edmond, Mrs. Rebecca Rock, as well as Miss Anthea Joshua. And Mr. Donnelly, I think we're going to start off with you, if you don't mind, because we've heard of this CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species for wildlife, wild fauna, and flora. If you could just maybe just very quickly tell us, what is CITES, how does it work, and what does St. Lucia have to do to make it work for St. Lucia?
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. CITES, it's an international agreement among world countries which seeks to protect, species, both species of, fauna and flora. Especially those species that are being traded. So, for various reasons, people interact with both animals and plants, and we would have heard from Laura, about the flora side. But yes, as well to the fauna side, the animals, and for various reasons, different animals would be both animals and plants, are being traded, among countries. So that agreement sought, to put measures, in place, and it was agreed among the world countries that in various ways, various steps or actions, would be taken to protect those species that are in trade. CITES came into force in 1975, and the way it works is that you have there are 3 appendices under which the species that are given various levels of protection. So you have the appendix 1 species. Now those species that are on the appendix 1, they trading, commercial trading is not allowed on the appendix 1, but you do have appendix 2 and appendix 3, in which commercial trading is allowed. But also you you have a system of permitting system that's allowed for the exporting and importation and exportation and re-exportation, of those species. So under the appendix, you'll find, I think there are about 40,000 species, and they all are broken down according to family groups, different taxonomical groups. In St. Lucia, well, St. Lucia acceded to CITES in that was 1982, but the enforcement really started in 1983. And CITES allows for scientific authorities. So you have a management authority, as well as the scientific authority, and it also allows for the integration of legislation into your national system, to make it effective. So these permitting systems which I mentioned previously would also allow for the importation and exportation of species that I trade and that are listed under the appendices.
Right. Thank you so very much for that, Mr. Donnelly, and for clearing up this idea about CITES. And we probably have to come back to you in a bit. But Jeremiah, another convention that we sometimes hear about, the Convention for Biological Diversity, and that's been around since, I think St. Lucia has signed on to that since 1995. What are we doing in terms of meeting our objectives under this convention?
St. Lucia signed or ratified the convention in 95, and since then we have actively been trying to implement the three objectives. The first objective is conservation, the second one is sustainable use, and the third one is access and benefit sharing. Like most countries around the world, we have been focused on objective 1 and 2, conservation and sustainable use. In terms of conservation, I mean, you see it, we really try to conserve our resource. We have established, or we have increased our forest reserve. We have designated more protected areas in our marine space. For sustainable use, the forestry department for years now has been pushing this whole idea of using our natural resource to get our rural communities into livelihoods, support systems where they use what we have to develop micro and small enterprise businesses. So you have a lot of persons who do latanier. Recently, they launched an initiative of mushroom growing in the forest. So that's what a lot been happening. Also, St. Lucia has also tried to meet their reporting commitments. We have submitted all our national reports, all 6 of them. One stipulation under the convention too is that countries supposed to develop national strategic and action plans. St. Lucia has so far developed 2 of these, and we have 1 revised. So we have really been trying. In terms of legislation, we have some bills in draft still, which we're trying to push out of draft, that would seek to get laws to really cover biodiversity in general, but there are also laws which indirectly support biodiversity in terms of the Soil and Water Conservation Act, you have the Fisheries Act, you have the Wildlife Act. So we have legislation, and we have been trying.
Okay, so there was a Congress of Parties, 15, I think, CBD, I think held in China. And, oh, okay, Canada, this was a Canada one. Okay. What are the new, and this came up with a global biodiversity framework, a new one. Could you tell us a little bit about this and what are the implications for islands such as St. Lucia?
Okay, so the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Kunming-Montreal because it was a two-part COP. The first part took place in 2021 in Kunming, and second part last year, December, in Montreal. So this, I think, thus far has been the most ambitious agreement the world has seen in terms of biodiversity conservation. It has 4 goals and 23 targets. So, in essence, the objective of this framework was by 2030 to put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2050. So, for small islands like ourselves and developing countries, this has some serious implications for us. Given our small size, the ambition which has been outlined in this framework, it will be a challenge for us to really achieve a lot of these, well, the targets outlined. One, firstly, because of the financial cost attached to it. The framework calls for new sources of financing for biodiversity. Globally, it has been recognized that biodiversity is underfinanced in terms of conservation, and for us to meet these goals, additional financing is required, and from all sources, local governments, from donors, from the private sector. So that's one challenge for us, getting that finance to finance these activities. Another implication for us is the technical or the complex monitoring of some of these targets, the capacity to monitor some of these targets. We may not have that capacity, so we need to build that capacity. And the GBF also calls for more scientific and technology transfer from developed countries to third world countries. So commitments have been made in that agreement to build the capacity of these developing and small island states. So hopefully, if the countries live up to their commitments, it would be a challenge, but it's not impossible for us to reach it. 2 important things that came out of that is, one, globally they pledge that 30% of the oceans need to be protected by 2030 to put us back on that path, as well as terrestrial ecosystem, 30%. So it's a 30 by 30, which is very ambitious, but not impossible if all of us collectively work towards that.
And one of these areas that's very important for us here in St. Lucia, no doubt being an island, is that of our wetlands, our coastal wetlands in particular. And Mrs. Rock, maybe you can jump in here, because we do have some level of protection at a local level, but also certainly through what is known as the Ramsar Convention. So maybe you may want to tell us a little bit about that Ramsar Convention and why it is so important for St. Lucia.
So good evening, everyone. The Ramsar Convention is called such because it was signed in Ramsar, Iran in 1971. St. Lucia became a party to the convention in 1992, where we listed the Savans Bay and the Makoti Mangrove as Ramsar sites. Why is this important to St. Lucia? It is because that wetland ecosystems are disappearing the fastest in the world. More than 60% of the world's wetlands have already disappeared. And it's because people don't see the value in wetlands. For many, it is like wasteland where other development can come in, and I guess where people see that it is more financially, there's more financial benefits from it if a port is developed, or if some other type of development is placed there instead of keeping the mangrove where it is. But there are many benefits from wetlands. Mangroves, seagrass beds, coral reefs, all of these are considered part of the wetland area. We'll use it for our touristic activities. We get these are used as fish nurseries. They sequester the most carbon than any ecosystem in the world. So we need to see wetlands as more, we need to value them. We need to do some sort of ecosystem valuation so that people can recognize the benefits to us as people in St. Lucia.
We're going to segue to Miss Anthea Joshua. She is an entrepreneur, and she's in fact a retired Government of St. Lucia officer and a manager of Lucian Expression, which involves production of souvenirs, natural souvenirs, paper products, bamboo, and of course we've seen some calabash here. She's engaged in using a lot of these various products, benefitive of course of our biodiversity. How are you dealing with the challenges at this point in time of using local products, of natural resources here in St. Lucia?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Challenges. First of all, before I answer that, one of the things that is difficult is to identify what it is in St. Lucia. Biodiversity needs to come out of the ministry, whatever ministry. Let the people know what it is, where it is. You understand? If, for example, you have an idea, you want to do something, your first reaction is to import it because you're not sure it's in St. Lucia. You don't know if it's in St. Lucia. And that to me is one of the biggest challenges, to know where you can get something that makes it uniquely St. Lucian, because that's our tagline, right? We want to make it, our goal is to compete with imports from China. We don't want, when you leave St. Lucia, to go to any other island, you will not get the souvenirs that you get from Lucian Expression. But we need to make it Lucian. So, for example, if a young person decides, I'm going into jewelry and I need to look for this seed, I know this seed that looks like a dolphin. Where do I get it? What's the name of this thing? You understand? So then you say, okay, you give up. But I think there's a tree lower down the hill there. But I don't know the name, and it's years I'm trying to figure out what it is. So, okay. All right. What common name? Right? But so that's one challenge. The other one is preserving whatever it is that you are doing. And to get something that is natural enough, that's not too chemically, so that it wouldn't be reverse to what you're trying to do in conserving your biodiversity. So where do you get the additives? What are the additives? Who do you go to for advice? So yes, people will always say finance and all, but for me, my biggest challenge is to how to preserve it, because okay, for paper, that's not much of a problem, but I've started to dabble with lip balm and oils and stuff, and these are wet things. For example, I do a banana oil. Now, the banana itself has a lot of water, so that even if you infuse it and all of that, there's still a lot of moisture in it. So if you don't use it very quickly, it goes rancid. So, because if I have a problem with a pest in my plant, I can go to the Ministry of Agriculture. But I have a problem with the rancidity in my oils. Who do I go to? Where do we get a system? So even in, yes, I heard we're doing mushrooms, but if there's a problem with the mushroom something. Or if, okay, I want to go into drying of mushrooms to make it taste like biscuits. Who helps me do that? So it's not so much, yes, we have all the biodiversity. I think we're fantastic where that is concerned. But to actually use it, know what we can and cannot trade in, where they are located. You know, because these days we have GIS and all of those things. That's supposed to have been more available to the community.
Some excellent points there indeed. Thanks so very much for sharing with that, Ms. Joshua. Now, of course, I'm not sure if we'll be able to cover all of that because what she's talking about, I suppose, is more along the lines of research and development and the institutions there to be able to support that. But coming to that issue, though, it's slightly related, and that of the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources. And Jeremiah, I think you may want to come in to join us regarding that. The Nagoya Protocol, what's going on with that in terms of St. Lucia?
St. Lucia recently acceded to the Nagoya Protocol last year in June. This is one of the most, how would I describe it, unpopular protocols under the CBD. I mean, it deals with genetic resources and the utilization of it. It also covers traditional knowledge. So this is a protocol with the least number of parties signed on. And with the Nagoya Protocol, it covers access and benefit sharing and the utilization of your genetic resource, but it does not cover food. So it covers everything outside of food. So St. Lucia acceded. So now, the importance of that for us is that being party to this protocol, for example, if someone comes in and try to, and they want to utilize our genetic resource, they must have pre and prior consent from the state to come in to use that resource. And they also, it is, well, under this protocol, it makes provisions for mutually agreed terms between this country and the person seeking to use this, so that you have some agreement that if anything comes out of your research or your utilization, you have to duly compensate the owner of the genetic resource. Now the problem is a lot of countries do not want to sign on because they want to use your resource without duly compensating the countries. And there's a big area of contention within CBD about digital sequence information, DSI. So a lot of developed countries believe that access to these resources should be free so that they can sequence it and use it. So it's right now a big area of contention with the developed world and the developing world as to how do we solve this issue with digital sequence information, and how do you adequately compensate us for using our resource to make millions, and that's it. But in St. Lucia, I mean, like Anthea was saying, it's true that we have a lot of resources, but a lot of persons don't really have the access to these resources, and not just go in and get it, but like she was saying, the knowing of what you have in that resource, the chemical composition, how does it work with other compounds, if you mix them. So, like you said, we have a lot of research and development to do, and this protocol makes provisions for that, where you have transfer of technology from developing to North-South corporations, where they help us in that area.
Thank you so very much for that, Jeremiah. And of course, we'd be here all night if we can get more into those issues of the various conventions. And there's a lot to unpack here, but I think enough food for thought to segue into that lecture, which we in fact are already waiting for, that Dr. Fletcher is in fact going to share with us. So thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen, for sharing with us on this side chat some really interesting points regarding St. Lucia and our interaction with these international biodiversity conventions.
Bio means life. Biodiversity is the variety of life all around us, all plants, animals, and microbes, and the places where they live. We need to protect biodiversity so that we can continue to enjoy all the resources it provides: fresh air, clean water, food, clothing, shelter, and recreation. Biosafety ensures that we protect biodiversity against any negative impacts of GMOs while using it safely for national development.
For more information on the Biosafety Project and how you can be involved, call 451-8746 or 722-9252. Log on to lc.biosafetyclearinghouse.net or join the mailing list slubiosafety@govt.lc.
And welcome back to our first ever inaugural Anita James Memorial Lecture in commemoration of International Biodiversity Day. And of course, the moment that we've been waiting for is here, but just allow me, because I think Jomo mentioned about Anita being a big gourmet in the forest. Well, I think we can describe this gentleman, who I didn't get a chance to recognize, as a big bay leaf tree in the forest. And I speak none other than our former Chief Forestry Officer, Mr. Donald Anthony. In fact, was just sharing us quite recently about a significant find in the Forest of Union, that wonderful bay leaf tree. Now, I'm not sure how he will describe himself in terms of a tree, whether he's a gourmet, a bay leaf, or a silk cotton tree, or maybe a châtaignier tree. But of course, Dr. James Fletcher is certainly a significant tree, maybe a redwood or sequoia. We don't have those here, no. But certainly a worldwide, a significant tree in our forest of biodiversity protection and, of course, climate change. Dr. Fletcher was the Minister for Public Service, Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia from 2011 to 2016. And during his tenure, he led an aggressive modernization of the energy sector with a focus on the transition to renewable energy. He commissioned modern ICT centers in several underserved communities, started a program for free island-wide Wi-Fi, developed a 311 call center for the public service, initiated major water development projects, and established an employee assistance program in the public service to provide free confidential counseling to public officers. James Fletcher played a leading role in the Caribbean's 1.5 to Stay Alive civil society campaign, and during the COP21 negotiations, he was selected by the COP president to be part of the ministerial team that helped achieve consensus on the elements of the Paris Agreement. He led the Caribbean's delegation to COP21 negotiations. He's been recognized by Global Optimism in Profiles of Paris as one of the people who played a key role in creating historic Paris Agreement. And of course, in 2019, he was selected by the United Kingdom Chevening Scholarship Program as one of 35 global change makers. James Fletcher has served in the government of St. Lucia as Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Permanent Secretary in the Office of the Prime Minister, and Cabinet Secretary. He was also Director of Social and Sustainable Development at the OACS Commission. He currently manages his own company, a consulting company, Soloricon, and he wrote and published the book, Governing in a Small Caribbean Island State. He's also authored the chapter, The Battle for Small Island Developing States, in the Cambridge University Press publication, Negotiating the Paris Agreement, The Insider Stories. He's also edited and published Where is the Justice? An anthology of Caribbean youth perspectives on the climate crisis. He also wrote the Regional Strategic Action Plan for Governance and Building Climate Resilience in the Water Sector in the Caribbean. In 2020, he launched the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, which advocates for climate justice for the people most impacted by climate change. And of course, Dr. Fletcher is a holder of a PhD degree in crop physiology from the University of Cambridge and a BSc with honors in biochemistry from the University of Ottawa in Canada. And of course, he is our inaugural Anita James Memorial Lecturer for this evening. May I welcome Dr. James Fletcher to the podium.
Good evening, everyone, family of the late Miss Anita James, officials of the Government of St. Lucia, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Minister, I hope we in biodiversity see a lot more of you this year. You have to remember your ministry is more than climate change. Those were Anita's words to me during the last staff meeting I held with the staff of the Department of Sustainable Development, in 2016, when that department was located above Caribbean Cinemas. I laughed and responded to Anita that 2015 had been a uniquely challenging year. The climate change negotiations, COP21, preparing for the third Financing for Development Conference in Addis Ababa, and the 2030 Development Agenda negotiations and the summit in New York had taken up all my time. And admittedly, I had not devoted as much time to the other parts of my ministry as I would have liked. However, I reassured Anita that she and biodiversity would see a lot more of me in 2016. Anita told me, okay, Mr. Minister, I will hold you to that. That brief encounter almost perfectly summed up Anita James. Very passionate about biodiversity and never hesitant about speaking her mind in support of the causes that were dear to her heart. And there were few dearer than biodiversity and environmental protection. You know, we've heard talk today about gourmets and big trees in the forest. And I'd like to continue on that theme because there are some people who are household names in St. Lucia because of their passion for what we now elegantly and sexily refer to as the blue-green economy. There are some people who are household names in St. Lucia because of their passion for what we now elegantly and sexily refer to as the blue-green economy. People like Gabriel Coco Charles, who's the father of forestry in our country. Horace Walters, for his work in the fisheries sector and guiding the birth of the Department of Fisheries. David DeMac, for his impressive body of work in agriculture. Our very own Laura Jomo Jean-Pierre, for what he has done in ethnobotany. Yves Renard, for untiring community mobilization and engagement around the country and across the sectors. And the lady we are remembering here tonight, Anita James, for her relentless dedication to and work in environmental education and biodiversity preservation. There are many more, but my slide could only take 5. These people epitomize the concept of agreement to action, which is the theme for this year's observance of International Biodiversity Day and tonight's inaugural lecture. In fact, for most, if not all of them, their work predated the existence of the multilateral agreements that now guide their respective sectors. They were not desk-bound practitioners. Their offices were the communities and the ecosystems around our country. Their work day started before 8 a.m. and ended long after 5 p.m., very often spilling over into weekends. They, and many others like them, are the unsung, unspoken, and unrecognized heroes of our country. I first met Anita James sometime after I joined the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries in 1991. I worked in the Research and Development Division at Union, and Anita worked in the Forestry Department, which she had joined 1 year before me as an environmental education officer. This was a natural progression for Anita, following her earlier career as a science teacher at South Louis Community College and the Soufrière Comprehensive Secondary School. Anita was the first environmental education officer in the Forestry Department. She worked tirelessly to infuse environmental education into the school curriculum, particularly through the Learning for Environmental Action Program, or LEAP, which packaged environmental education resources for teachers to use in the classroom. Although she's not widely known outside of the Forestry Department for her work in ecotourism, Anita played a major role in the development of the signage and the description of the nature trails of the Forestry Department that caused locals and visitors to appreciate the importance and role of our forests and their wildlife, and which gave birth to our island's ecotourism product. I left the ministry in 1995, but our paths would cross again when I rejoined the ministry as its permanent secretary in 1998. During my tenure as PS, sometime around 2000 or 2001, I can't remember the exact date, Anita was appointed as the National Biodiversity Coordinator, and her office moved to the fourth floor of our ministry's head office on the waterfront. Her passion and interest had evolved and expanded. She was no longer just an environmental educator. She was now the one who was helping our ministry and our country to understand and appreciate the importance of biodiversity. Her scope was now local, regional, and global. And Anita quickly became a highly respected fount of knowledge on biodiversity and a formidable advocate for the protection of our country's wide variety of flora and fauna. 10 years later, in December 2011, I became the minister of a portfolio that joined forestry, water resources management, biodiversity, climate change, oversight of the Pito management area, and environmental protection under one roof in the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Energy, Science, and Technology. And Anita James managed the biodiversity program in that ministry. As an aside, in my humble opinion, that is the best configuration for environmental management in our country. But regrettably, these decisions are above my pay grade. In all the years that I knew her, Anita James was always maximally engaged and energized in environmental conservation and biodiversity protection. Her passion never wavered or faltered. However, I understand the frustration that caused Anita to admonish me for giving too much time to climate change and not enough to biodiversity. Since the 3 Rio Conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification were adopted at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the Framework Convention on Climate Change has received more attention globally and in almost all national jurisdictions than any of the other 2 conventions. More recently, there was much more global press and attention on climate change in the 4 months that followed the adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change on 12 December 2015 than there has been on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted on 19 December 2022, less than 1 month after Anita had passed. In fact, to add insult to injury, in the promotion of a webinar on the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, website of the interlinkages between climate change and biodiversity in the Asia-Pacific region, I saw a reference to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as a Paris Agreement for nature. Anita would not have been impressed by that reference. So what exactly is the landmark framework agreement that the world agreed to in Montreal in December of last year, which has been referred to as the Paris Agreement for Nature? First of all, the framework comprises 4 goals, 3 of which align with the 3 goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as we heard from Jeremiah, just like the 2030 Development Agenda, the Global Biodiversity Framework the 2030 Development Agenda contains 17 goals, 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and 169 targets. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework contains 23 targets to guide us and help us assess our progress. 23 targets and 4 goals. The first goal, Goal A, speaks to the need to maintain, enhance, or restore the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems in order to substantially increase the area of natural ecosystem by 2050. It refers to the need to halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species, increase the abundance of native wild species to healthy and resilient levels, and maintain the genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated animals. Goal A of the Global Biodiversity Framework aligns with the first goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The second goal, Goal B, seeks to ensure the sustainable use and management of biodiversity and for nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services, to be valued, maintained, and enhanced. Goal B is congruent with the second goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which calls for the sustainable use of the components of biodiversity. The third goal, Goal C, calls for the fair and equitable sharing of the monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources, digital sequence information on genetic resources, and of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. It recognizes the rights of indigenous people and local communities to sharing in these benefits and the need for protection of the traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Like the two previous goals, Goal C is aligned to the third goal of the CBD and the principles that are enshrined in the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. The fourth goal, Goal D, makes provision for adequate means of implementation, including financial resources, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, and access to and transfer of technology to fully implement the Global Biodiversity Framework. When the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity came up with the theme for IBD, International Biodiversity Day 2023, its intention was to draw attention to the need for action to reach the goals and targets of the landmark COP15 Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Knowing this, therefore, how should we go about converting the goals that are espoused in the framework to actions that are relevant and important for us in St. Lucia and the Caribbean? That is the important translation that we must do for every multilateral agreement. These agreements are drawn up so that there may be areas of commonality for the almost 200 countries that are party to them. That is the only way you can have countries in both the global north and the global south, which are very diverse and spread out over the international socio-economic spectrum, finding elements in a multilateral agreement to which they can agree. And equally importantly, which will not cause them any serious economic, political, or social discomfort. This requirement often results in the goals being broad and some of the targets not quite relevant for every country. So, why should biodiversity conservation be important to us? What makes Anita James such a visionary for developing a passion for biodiversity from as early as 2000 and schooling us in its vital importance for St. Lucia and the Caribbean when so few will focus on the subject? When we speak of biodiversity or biological diversity, we're referring to the variety of life on our planet and the natural interactions they form with each other and the environment. In addition to the large number of species of plants, animals, and microorganisms, and scientists believe that there may be roughly 13 million species on planet Earth. In fact, the numbers vary. Some tell you it's between 10 and 100, but the number seems to settle around 13 million. Biodiversity also refers to the genetic differences within species. Our Caribbean, this beautiful region of the world in which we live, is recognized as a biodiversity hotspot because it has such a rich variety of plant and animal species, many of which are endemic to our region. Of the 11,000 plant species found in the Caribbean, 72% are endemic. A significant percentage of our 600 bird species are endemic. There are 60 species of coral and roughly 1,500 species of fishes recorded, with nearly 25% being endemic. Therefore, we have the responsibility to ensure that these endemic species are preserved, because if they are lost to our region, they are lost to the world. However, just stating that the Caribbean is a biodiversity hotspot and proclaiming that we have an obligation to protect the species that are found only in our region is not enough to compel the majority of us to action. After all, that is the argument that we use for our pitons, their outstanding universal value and our obligation to protect them for the benefit of our global civilization. How has that worked? Should I go there tonight? I will not, partly because I will be preaching to the converted in this room, but also because I want to explore some other avenues. Our biodiversity is important for several economic, social, environmental, and cultural reasons. Let's start with the area that usually catches the attention of our policymakers, the economic imperative. Once we speak economic, everybody stands up and pays attention. Our biodiversity underpins three of the major drivers of Caribbean economies: tourism, agriculture, and fisheries. Tourists come to the Caribbean to experience the uniqueness of our natural environment, the breathtakingly beautiful seascapes with the colorful reefs and marine life, hopefully with the chance to see Nemo, as well as our equally beautiful terrestrial flora. Our fisheries sector depends on the health and integrity of our marine ecosystems. In the same way, the crop and livestock sectors rely on the delicate balance between the species and the ecosystems in which they live. Any serious disruption to the balance between life forms and ecosystems can significantly impact these economic sectors. The variety of Caribbean cuisine, the variety of our Caribbean cuisine, derives from the wide range of plant species and fish and seafood at our disposal. That is biodiversity in its most delectable form. Closely related to this is the food security provided by our biodiversity, although unfortunately, many of us appear to eschew that food security in favor of the unhealthy, expensive, unlimited variety we get from processed foods in our supermarkets. Moreover, the diversity of our agriculture and our livestock, as well as genetic diversity within some plant cultivars, also confer resilience to pest diseases, warm temperatures, and drought. Our biodiversity allows us to maintain the ecological balance of our Caribbean. The myriad species of plants, animals, and microorganisms play very important roles in our ecosystems, such as nutrient cycling, soil formation and regeneration, pollination, water filtration, and carbon sequestration. The last of these speaks to the importance of our Caribbean rainforests as carbon sinks. Losing elements of our biodiversity would have a significant effect on these critical ecosystem services. The Caribbean's biodiversity is important for a subject that has influenced much of Jomo's work and was dear to Anita's heart, and that is its importance in traditional medicine. Our native pharmacopoeia is based on the efficacy of the compounds found in the rich variety of medicinal plants that grow in our region. Unfortunately, and this is a subject that I've spoken about repeatedly in public fora, we have largely ignored the economic potential of these plants and instead allowed companies like Whole Foods, Holland & Barrett, and The Body Shop to make huge profits from the use of our biodiversity in their nutraceuticals and beauty products. Every time I visit Whole Foods and see the array of bitter lemon, soursop, turmeric, ginger, and other Caribbean-based plant products, I wince. I remember there was an initiative in 2015 between the then Ministry of Sustainable Development and the University of the West Indies under Professor Leonard Ogaro to explore the economic benefits of our biodiversity. Anita was spearheading this for our ministry. I do not know whether anything materialized from this, but this is an area that certainly must be pursued. I recall every year when I was a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture in the late 1990s to early 2000s, receiving a request for permission of a research vessel from some place or the other to conduct research in our waters. At the conclusion of the stay of the respective vessels, the ministry would be furnished with a bland research report that said nothing of any significance. In hindsight, we should have insisted in one of our officers being stationed on the vessel, or at the very least, conducting regular visits to the vessel to determine the nature of the research being undertaken and to ensure that nothing was being extracted from our marine ecosystems. In the event that these so-called research expeditions are still taking place, I would strongly recommend, in fact implore, the Departments of Fisheries, Sustainable Development, Marine Police, and the AG's chambers to collaborate to put in place a protocol to safeguard our intellectual property. I remember when I was a minister listening to the former Chief Forest Officer Adam Stuse talk about his work on Proteum attenuatum, or the Lassa tree, as it is called. Lassa is widely distributed in St. Lucia, but its population is decreasing in some of the other islands. It has great potential for use in aromatherapy, which in recent times has become an increasingly important industry. We need to protect and manage this species and sustainably use it because it has promising commercial potential. However, we must pay close attention to the health of the trees we have on island. In a recent conversation with Adams, he told me that where previous inventories of the trees on island had recorded trunk diameters of between 40 and 50 centimeters, recent inventories had indicated a reduction of the trunk diameters to 20 to 25 centimeters. That is clearly a cause for concern and needs to be investigated because it speaks to the integrity of that species, the integrity of that resource. But it is not just our flora that has medicinal values. one of the most dreaded animals in our country may hold the secret to the next scientific breakthrough in cardiovascular medicine. I recall an incident in the Christmas season, sometime around the year 2000, when one of the forest officers on the Millet Range was bitten by a featherless. By the time I was contacted on New Year's Eve, the officer was in a bad way in the ICU department at Victoria Hospital. Dr. Martin Didier was the attending physician. I was told the officer needed to be flown out to Martinique immediately if we were to have any hope of saving his life. I received that call around 1 p.m. on New Year's Eve. I remember that. It was from Jabba, from Michael Andrew. I admonished him for taking so long to call me, and particularly because I'd already left the ministry. And if I recall correctly, I was hanging out with some friends on Coral and Grass Streets in Castries. This meant that there was no way I could get funds from the Treasury to pay the air ambulance, which was a prerequisite for it to make the trip to St. Lucia. So I called someone I knew at the Bank of Nova Scotia, which was my bank, and pleaded with them to facilitate a withdrawal of $500 from my account for what I explained was an emergency of desperate proportions. I brought the cash to Dr. Didier at VH, and he allowed me to see the snakebite victim. Honestly, I did not think that he would make it past the weekend. So I said a silent prayer and left the hospital. I do not think I'd reached far when I received another phone call, this time from Dr. Didier. The hospital in Martinique would not accept our forestry officer unless there was a guarantee that the government would pay his hospital bills. I then did something that I would not advise any public officer to ever do. However, I would do it again without thinking. I went into the Ministry of Agriculture, the head office, wrote, printed, and signed and faxed a letter on Ministry of Agriculture official letterhead to the hospital administrator in Martinique, indicating that the government of St. Lucia would meet all the costs associated with the care and treatment of the officer. To cut a long story mercifully short, a few months later, the officer walked into my office with a box of produce for me as a mark of appreciation for my efforts. However, the reason for this dramatic trip down memory lane is that during the treatment of this officer in Martinique, the doctors found that the unusual symptoms of the snake bite, including capillary thrombosis, closely resembled the symptoms of some major forms of heart disease, which led them to believe that the venom from our dreaded featherless may provide a basis for future cardiovascular treatments. But there's a precedent for this. The venom of a relative of our featherless, the Brazilian viper, Bothrops jaracara, was the basis for the development of the first angiotensin-converting enzyme, or ACE inhibitor, called captopril, which completely changed cardiovascular treatment in the 1980s. Captopril is an FDA-approved drug that is used in the management of high blood pressure, left ventricular dysfunction after myocardial infarction or heart attack, and diabetic nephropathy, or kidney damage caused by diabetes. All of this from the venom of the Brazilian version of our featherless. So why, you might ask, are we not feverishly conducting research on the featherless venom, the St. Lucian featherless venom, to see if it can unlock a new revolutionary treatment for hypertension and or heart disease? Well, the sad news is research is being conducted on the venom, just not by us. The Kentucky Reptile Zoo is selling the venom of Bothrops caribeus, our featherless, found only in St. Lucia, for US $250 per gram, with shipping, packing, and permit charges extra. It is one of the most expensive venoms offered for sale on their website. Apparently, some years ago, predating my stint as permanent secretary, an official of the Forestry Department authorized the expatriation of our featherless to the United States, where its progeny have been supplying venom for sale by the Kentucky Reptile Zoo to all and sundry. Therefore, if we do not rush and genetically mark and register this venom, something that I attempted to secure funding for from the Jeff when I was a minister, and I see Caroline in the room, I remember us having that conversation, we may not benefit from any products derived from this venom. Our biodiversity also has cultural significance. Many species have cultural or spiritual significance, and our traditional and indigenous knowledge, something that Laura spoke of, which is of great intrinsic value to small island developing states, often revolves around the use of our biodiversity for food, medicine, and building material. Very importantly, our mangroves and coral reefs play a very important role in disaster risk reduction, acting as buffers against hurricanes, storm surges, and floods by absorbing the impacts of waves, reducing flooding, minimizing the damage to coastal communities, and acting as a filter that traps sediment that is washed away by heavy rains and prevents it from getting into our oceans. Hopefully by now, I'm succeeding in making a case for taking action to preserve our biodiversity and doing the job that Anita would have wanted me to do tonight here in this room. Unfortunately, however, Caribbean biodiversity is under threat from habitat destruction and poor land use practices, invasive alien species, and climate change. In the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s, the growth and success of the banana industry caused many habitats to be destroyed to allow for expansion of banana farms. Over the last 20 years, the deforestation has been driven by construction. In 1996, we had 51,323 acres of agricultural holdings in St. Lucia. By 2007, when the last agricultural census was undertaken, and we are way overdue for another agricultural census, that figure had dropped to 30,204 acres. That is the sum total of arable land in our country. That was back in 2007. When you think of what has happened in areas like Cul-de-sac, Roseau, and Barbano over the last 15 years, you can appreciate how that figure must have plummeted even further. When you juxtapose these figures, with the fact that in many instances, farmlands have been replaced with brick and mortar infrastructure, you get a better appreciation of how we have drastically altered the habitats of so much of the flora and fauna on our island. Therefore, an essential element of the action needed for building back biodiversity must be the enactment and enforcement of land use policies that protect our critical terrestrial ecosystems. We must also engage in the restoration of our damaged ecosystems. The same holds for our watersheds. According to WASCO, water is life. So if we were to believe WASCO, and on this occasion I believe WASCO, if our supplies of water are compromised, then we are imperiling our country's ability to maintain its biodiversity. Regrettably, many of our country's 37 watersheds have been damaged from deforestation and poor land use. 10 of the 37 watersheds account for roughly 90% of the dry season flow of water. So right now, in the dry season, 10 of our 37 watersheds are accounting for roughly 90% of the dry season flow. And 15 of those watersheds, less than half of the total number, account for 99% of the dry season flow. So really, the water we're getting from our rivers during this dry season and every dry season is basically being supplied by 15 of the 37 watersheds we have on the island. Some of the watersheds that used to be productive are no longer viable. The Marquis watershed is the 5th largest watershed on our island, and it has the 8th highest wet season flow. However, during the dry season, there are 14 other rivers with higher flow rates. During the dry season, farmers along that Marquis River, vegetable farmers, abandon their farms because they just cannot get water. And somebody was saying to me that with the amount of water that's been extracted from pumps along that, there are parts of the river that are basically dry. We should embark on a comprehensive rehabilitation of our watersheds, which would include the restoration of forest cover and the establishment of new forest cover where needed. We must engage with and involve communities in watershed protection, starting with a concerted program of public education, the forte of the person we are remembering here tonight. I remember some years ago, the Forestry Department employed a successful co-management approach in Talvan, where the community was brought together into a water users group to help manage the resource. This should be replicated around the island. We cannot depend on or expect public officials to police us 24/7 and stop us from doing the things that harm us. The answer to this is intense and sustained public education and community engagement. Invasive alien species, which is a term I became very familiar with during my stint as a minister in charge of forestry, present a very serious threat to our biodiversity. After habitat destruction, they are the second most important threat to global biodiversity. The most recent estimate I saw puts the annual cost of invasive alien species to St. Lucia at $244 million EC dollars. Let that figure sink in. 244 million EC dollars is the most recent estimate of the cost of invasive alien species to St. Lucia. What makes invasive alien species so dangerous for us is that their pathways intersect with our primary livelihoods: trade, transport, travel, tourism, agriculture, and fisheries. There are several examples of the damage that invasive alien species cause to all three pillars of sustainable development. Many years ago, we saw the devastating impact of the pink hibiscus mealybug on our native hibiscus population. The varroa mite, an introduction that coincided with my stint as permanent secretary, caused serious distress to bee farmers in our country. And at the time, I remember they said it might have been somebody who came in from Martinique with some bees in an empty matchbox. And that was how the varroa mite was introduced to St. Lucia. In addition to affecting the production of honey, the mite also decreased the population of one of the most important pollinators in our ecosystem. In addition to being harmful to divers who it stings, the lionfish has reduced the population of small reef fish, which are important for controlling the growth of algae in our coral reef ecosystems. The lionfish is known for eating anything it can fit into its mouth, and I will resist any temptation to go any further with that imagery. The sargassum seaweed has caused significant losses in the fisheries sector, with reports of fish kills, die-offs of corals and seagrass beds, beach erosion, and disruption in turtle nesting sites. It has caused serious physical and emotional discomfort, and in some instances, health problems, ranging from asthma attacks to cough and respiratory problems, skin rashes, headaches, and dizziness for the people who live and recreate on the east coast of our islands. It has negatively impacted the tourism sector in many of our islands, particularly for the hotels and tourism sites that are located along the east coast. If you have to look for a positive in all of this, I guess it is that sargassum has brought with it an abundance of kawang fish. However, even for a pescatarian like me, that's not a good thing. I don't like kawang. One of my arch enemies, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is in fact an invasive alien species, is responsible for several deadly vector-borne diseases like dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. The green iguana is another invasive alien species. It reproduces faster than our endemic St. Lucia iguana. And it is important to remember that our St. Lucia iguana is what gave our island its name, Ayanola, the land of the iguana. But it is also a distinct endemic subspecies, which is critically endangered and found only along the northeastern coast of our island. The invasive green iguana, which was most likely smuggled into St. Lucia as a pet, and I read something, I think it was Michael Bob who said that there's some intelligence that suggests it was originally purchased from a pet shop in Canada, has now multiplied and is prevalent in the Soufrière area. Hopefully, our efforts to eradicate this invasive species will be successful before it invades and takes over the habitat of our native iguana and/or mates with it. In our World Heritage Site, the Petor Management Area, invasive ornamentals such as the wandering Jew, Tradescantia zebrina, and golden tendril or the basket plant, Calicia fragrans, now beginning to sound like Laura when I run these scientific names out, have encroached into the habitat of, and that's them there, the wandering Jew and Calicia fragrans, have encroached into the habitat of endemic plants such as Gonulobus ionolensis, which is our endemic species. The only place in the world where this plant is found, if I'm not mistaken, Laura, is in the PMA, is in the Petor Management Area. The prevalence and the presence of invasive alien species in the PMA was raised as a concern in the limits of acceptable change, the LAC report on the PMA. Yet, we allow the construction of residential homes within the no-build area of the PMA by people who have no knowledge or appreciation of our patrimony, in direct contravention of the stipulations of the LAC report. Go figure. Therefore, in taking action to build back our biodiversity, we must address the problem of invasive alien species through intensified and persistent public education. Anita's pet again. Strict biosecurity and border control measures, and effective management and eradication programs. We must take the threat of invasive alien species very seriously. Now, you know, if I were to stand here and speak on an environmental issue and not mention climate change, you'd know that something was seriously wrong. Fortunately, nothing is seriously wrong. There's an intersection between climate change and biodiversity. And it's coincidental and perhaps appropriate that the theme for this year's International Day of Biodiversity revolves around building back biodiversity, because build back better is a phrase that is used extensively and popularly in climate change and disaster risk reduction circles to highlight the need to strengthen systems and build resilience. The same holds for biodiversity and climate change. Climate change is already having serious negative effects on biodiversity. The impacts of climate change, hotter land temperatures, stronger hurricanes, prolonged droughts, warmer ocean temperatures, sea level rise, and ocean acidification will alter the biodiversity of our region in very dramatic ways. Let's start with the impact on land ecosystems. The changes in temperature and precipitation will affect the vegetation zones in our region and the plant and animal species that live in these zones. As conditions in certain zones get hotter and drier, the species that are mobile may migrate to higher altitudes, while those that are immobile will either have to adapt as best they can within the truncated period available to them or die. Warmer temperatures will also accelerate metabolic and reproductive rates of some animals, and this can have all types of consequences. As an example, let's revisit my least favorite species on the planet, the mosquito. As you know, the Anopheles mosquito carries malaria, which is caused by a single-celled microorganism that belongs to the Plasmodium genus. Malaria causes fever, fatigue, nausea, headaches, jaundice, seizures, coma, and sometimes death. The most virulent strain is Plasmodium falciparum. Unfortunately, as temperatures get warmer, the growth cycle of Plasmodium falciparum inside the mosquito shortens. So it develops faster, and this can increase transmission, which in turn can increase the disease burden. Also, regrettably, mosquito activity increases as the temperature increases. You'll note that during our so-called cool months, our winter months, December, January, February, you don't get that much mosquito activity. You get the high mosquito activity during the warmer months. Mosquitoes do not like cool temperatures. Research has shown that an increase in global temperatures could lengthen annual transmission seasons by more than a month for malaria and 4 months for dengue over the next 50 years. Therefore, we have the scary prospect of a rapidly multiplying lethal microorganism growing inside a mosquito with increased biting activity during a lengthened transmission season as a prospect of the intersection between climate change and biodiversity. Basically, a mosquito on steroids. The situation in our oceans is not any better. Ocean temperatures are warmer than they have been at any point in the recent history of our planet. This is causing coral bleaching. What is happening essentially is that as the corals become stressed from higher temperatures or pollution or change in the chemistry of the water, they expel the symbiotic algae that live on them. These algae provide the corals with food and oxygen, while the corals provide them with a safe place to live. The perfect symbiotic relationship. However, when the algae are expelled, the corals lose their color and they turn white. If the stress is removed and the algae come back, the coral can recover. However, if the stress continues over a prolonged period of living without the algae, the corals will die. The consequences of the death of our corals are several, none of them good. Corals provide a home for several species of fish and marine animals. They protect coastlines from erosion and storms. They also play a dual role in carbon dioxide regulation through the photosynthetic activity of the algae that live on them and the sequestration of carbon in the calcium carbonate that forms their calcareous skeletons. It has been estimated that coral reefs are a carbon sink for 70 to 90 megatons of carbon per year. Unfortunately, the converse also holds true. As corals bleach and eventually die, this carbon dioxide is released back out. Our oceans also serve as an important sink for carbon dioxide. Oceans absorb roughly 30% of the carbon dioxide that is released into the atmosphere. As more carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels, our oceans are forced to absorb more of this gas. The balance of, and this is a bit of chemistry 101 here, the balance of hydrogen and carbonate ions in the seawater will change. In the new equilibrium, more hydrogen ions are available, but there are fewer carbonate ions. This makes it difficult. So the pH of the water, the acidity of the pH drops, the water becomes more acidic. This makes it difficult for animals that have shells like whelks, shrimp, oysters, clams, sea urchins, lobsters to build and maintain their shells. Corals are also impacted. Additionally, it has been shown that the ability of certain species of fish to detect their predators is decreased in more acidic waters. All of these severely alter marine biodiversity, affect the marine food chain, and just as importantly and very selfishly, make nutrition problematic for people like me who rely on fish and seafood as our primary source of protein. Sea level rise and storm surges from intense hurricanes lead to the loss of coastal habitats such as mangroves and seagrass beds, which serve as breeding grounds for several species. Sea level rise also affects the nesting sites of turtles. I cannot end without saying something very briefly about the impacts of pollution on biodiversity. The primary culprit for us are the land-based sources of pollution. Just this morning, I saw videos of schools, and I'm now referring to them as schools of plastic, swimming purposefully in the Castries River on their way to a rendezvous with the sea in the Castries Harbor. Plastics are choking our drains, clogging up our rivers, invading our oceans, and killing our marine life. This is another stressor of our biodiversity that is completely within our capacity to address. How do we address it? We focus on consistent public education and awareness and strict enforcement of legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, we need a completely new approach to development and to environmental management in our country. Our environment cannot be an afterthought. Environmental impact assessments should not be another box that we check off in the planning process. They must be used as an inviolable guide for how development should proceed in our respective communities. We must encourage research and monitoring to constantly assess the state of our biodiversity and our environmental resources. We should aim to produce an annual State of the Environment report. It may sound ambitious, but it will help us to focus attention where it is needed. It will give us indicators of where we are succeeding and where we are failing. And it will help us to leverage international support for biodiversity conservation and environmental management. We can use a combination of field surveys, remote sensing, and citizen science, which is extremely important, and now much more possible with the use of these devices, these very powerful computing devices called cell phones and tablets that we carry everywhere with us. We can use all of these to produce this annual State of the Environment report. It will facilitate an evidence-based approach to policy formulation and decision-making at the community and national levels. We need to mobilize more resources for the protection of our environment. The environment is the substrate of which everything feeds. Our quality of life, our nutrition, the attractiveness of our country as a tourism destination, everything depends on a healthy environment. Last year, in a landmark ruling, the United Nations General Assembly voted unanimously to affirm that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right for all and not just a privilege for some. If there is an amendment to our St. Lucia Constitution, I would like to see that right enshrined in Chapter 1, which deals with the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of St. Lucians. I would like to see a declaratory statement in there that every St. Lucian is entitled to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. As a corollary to the UN ruling that made the right to a healthy environment a human right, I would like to see some of the critical multilateral environmental agreements like the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity made legally binding on all parties. In much the same way that there is a dispute settlement mechanism within the World Trade Organization, where disputes can be filed over the non-implementation of measures or the use of harmful practices, parties obligated to implement the ruling of the panel and, if applicable, the appellate body, and the option for countermeasures to be applied if the losing party fails to implement the ruling. If this can work for trade, which is not a life and death situation, why should it not also be used for climate change, biodiversity conservation, desertification, persistent organic pollutants, and transboundary movement of hazardous waste, which all have very serious life and death consequences. So we're using a dispute settlement mechanism and putting penalties on countries for violating trade rules, but we're saying to the countries that are violating environmental treaties, that are causing countries to disappear, that are causing people to lose their lives, that are causing ecosystems to be damaged and species to go extinct. We're saying that no, there's no dispute settlement mechanism. There's just a gentleman's agreement, and boy, you shouldn't do that, and let's have another COP so that we can discuss what we're doing and tell you how you shouldn't be doing it. That's not good enough. Hopefully, the recent decision by the UN General Assembly to request that the International Court of Justice issue an advisory opinion on a case by our Pacific SID sister, Vanuatu, on the legal obligations of countries under international law to protect our climate for present and future generations will usher in a new and more honest, robust, and equitable treatment of these existential environmental issues. Friends, I've said a lot. However, if there are 4 things that I would like you to take away from this evening's talk, they are the following. 1, our biodiversity is under serious threat. And the large reductions in biodiversity we are experiencing are on the scale of a mass extinction, which we've now called the Anthropocene extinction or the 6th mass extinction. That's how serious it is. That's what we are going through right now. Secondly, as the term suggests, human beings and human activity are at the center of the massive loss of biodiversity we are currently experiencing. This means, however, that by changing our model of development and our patterns of behavior, we can put a stop to this extinction and we can start to build back biodiversity. Thirdly, the biodiversity conventions and frameworks give us a very good blueprint for the steps that must be taken. However, these agreements are useless if they are not followed up with serious, committed, and urgent action across the length and breadth of our country and our region. The type of brave, committed, community-based, and people-centered action that people like Coco Charles, DeMarc, Jomo, Eve, and Anita were famous for. And finally, the most important tool that we have in our arsenal is public education and awareness. That is how we will change the knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and practices of our people. From our political leaders and business leaders to our ordinary citizens, the men and women on the Gros-Islet, Soufrière, and Vieux-Fort buses. And as a very depressing side note, I read today that on International Biodiversity Day, a hawksbill turtle was found slaughtered on VG Beach. That's us. We need to change that. We need to change that attitude that makes people believe that we are the only ones who matter on this planet. Because if not, we'll find that, and people always talk about we have to save planet Earth. Planet Earth will go on without us. We're the ones who will go extinct. There will be a version of planet Earth when we're not there, and when species have gone extinct. Planet Earth will survive. We will not. And I think we need to get that point across to people. Anita James understood this and devoted her life to using environmental education as a tool for positive change at the community and national levels. We must honor that legacy. Thank you very much.
At this point, I believe we have enough time to invite the audience to pose a few questions to Dr. Fletcher, and of course to tease him and to find out about the $250 a gram venom, of course, over at the University of Kentucky, or maybe about how we can achieve $250 mangoes, which of course are being produced over in the north of Japan right now. And of course, that quite often is the big question. How do you balance, of course, the issues of economics with the challenge of protection and science of protection? So I'm not sure if there are any questions. If you do have, you could just raise your hand.
Well, I normally go to VG Beach to have my lunch, and there's always competition for spots for vehicles to park. And what determines the best spot is the shade from the trees that are there. So if you take out those trees, then it will not be popular anymore, So that, I guess, speaks to what, Laura's talking about, the to preserve our flora. When I was a student at St. Mary's College, in the 80s, we had lots of Jack Spaniards. The last time I saw Jack Spaniard was at Meadows Batch at VG in 1990. I took a picture of it. I haven't seen any since, so they seem to have disappeared. I'm not sure why. I noticed too that we're losing our fireflies. You have to go in the country to see a firefly. You cannot see them in the city because the light interference is has chasing them away. So the environment is changing around us. It's probably at us. The insects are disappearing, and of course maybe that because maybe the birds eat them, they also has an impact, on the food chain. So it's something that we know we need to observe what's happening around us because eventually we will disappear too.
So, Dr. Fletcher, you were mentioning about the fertilizers and the Lucia. We submitted a project to Jeff last year, and it actually got approved, where we're going to be doing some work on exploring the fertilizer venom as well as the Lucia, what can come out of that. So that has been approved. It's supposed to be starting off later in the year, next 2 or 3 months. And there's also under that project, there's also a public and education and awareness, because we all know the connotations with the fertilizer. So this project would be a very hard one to sell, I think, because most persons, when they have fertilizers, that's just it for them. When they have fertilizers, conversation end. Fertilizers is kill. So I think the forestry department has a big hill ahead of them to climb. On that project, we're also working with the same KRZ. One component is for them to come in to actually train St. Lucians in handling venomous snakes. So we're trying on that end, and that's one of our our first ABS project that we trying to roll out later on this year.
Can I ask whether the projects involve the genetic fingerprinting of both the featherless venom and the Lucia?
Well,
because that you have to do that. If you don't do that, if you don't
so
establish that as being yours, then you have no basis for doing anything else.
So it covers that, to try to get the genetic to actually do that. So that's one component. So that's one component, and the other one is the exploration. So the first part is to actually do that and then do exploration. We're working with this. Well, one of the partners is a Costa Rican institute, Clorodomo Picado, I think. So they actually doing a lot of work on venomous snakes, and there's one doctor from Martinique who actually is doing a lot of research on the Martinique fertilizers. So the idea is to do work on the St. Lucian fertilizers and to eventually develop our own antivenom based on our fertilizer, because our antivenom is used from another viper in South America. So that's one component also, to see if we can develop our own antivenom for our fertilizer, which would be hopefully more effective than the one that is currently being used from Costa Rica right now.
Okay, but one easy way to get solutions to appreciate the value of the featherless is show them what happened in Brazil with the Brazilian pit viper and what Captopril has done and the revenue Captopril has brought in, and tell them that this is what our featherless is capable of doing for us. So they will not see the featherless as just this beast that needs to be killed every time it raises its ugly head because of what it can do, but they can now see the featherless as something that can bring significant economic value to St. Lucia and St. Lucians. I'm sure you'll probably find people starting to catch featherlesses and put them in cages to see how they can they can farm featherlesses. They'll have a totally different approach to featherless once they see that the featherless has economic value.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Dr. Fletcher, in these days, there's talk about a multipolar world. How do you see that affecting, the conventions and the agreements that we signed off to? Whether, if there's a break, whether all parties will continue to adhere, or whether persons will just go their own way for their own economic or whatever means. Just your thoughts on that?
That's always a danger, because the multilateral process only works if everybody agrees to it. And what you will see as some of these multilateral agreements take too long in bringing results to the disaffected, the affected parties, the people who are the victims. And that's why I raised the point about why can't we have the same dispute settlement process for environmental agreements that we have for trade? Because if, for example, we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, the Paris Agreement is supposed to be that by 2050, we move to a net zero carbon world. But between 2015 and now, the same countries, the same developed countries, have pumped $3.3 trillion worth of subsidies into their fossil fuel sector. So they are doing the exact opposite of what they committed in the Paris Agreement to do. And that is causing more distress for us. So what redress does St. Lucia or Vanuatu or the Marshall Islands or St. Kitts and Nevis or the Bahamas have? To go back to another COP and say, "Guys, sir, you shouldn't be doing that, man." And that's why I think people are becoming a little disenchanted with the multilateral process, because they find it's taking too much time. It's not moving with the same urgency that they're seeing the environmental risks exploding around them. But we have to keep the multilateral process alive, and we have to, because if the multilateral process breaks down, then you don't have any forum, any medium for bringing everybody to the table. However, I think one of the things that you can do, and that's why I spoke about the justice component. The tobacco companies, the big tobacco companies, never did anything about tobacco causing lung cancer until they started litigating against them, and they were hit with large lawsuits that caused them to pay out. I think we have to now start pursuing, which is why I like what Vanuatu is doing so much, that let's bring this up to the ICJ and let the ICJ give us a ruling on whether these countries are legally liable. Because you'll find when there's a legal liability attached to a country, and that's why Dawn can tell you the biggest issue in climate change negotiations is liability and compensation. Nobody wants to be held liable. Once you can hold people liable, they'll act differently. So I think we have to use the multilateral process as the carrot and the litigation process as the big stick. That's what will hold the multilateral process together. Because if you do that, they will want to have that multilateral process alive and well so that they can continue the negotiations in a way that does not cause them injury. I would hate to see the multilateral process break down and you have a global north and a global south doing their own thing, because when you do that, the planet is what suffers.
Dr. Fletcher, I just want to make a general comment that will tie into, on the basis of public education and sensitization that Anita was so passionate about, and link that to research and development. If I could go back to my experience at forestry and Orange is there. We spent years on the Parrot project, a lot of research was done, and what you find, and let me link that to the public sector reform, that I find that government departments and public services are based on a vertical integration. So people come back steady with all the stuff, and on the lateral level where all the research and all that thing could be done, and a lot of people are probably moving in the higher sort of echelon where they, the economic are better, and all of those aspects kind of fall by the wayside. So I just wanted to throw that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ricky. And I think what we need to do for that is the whole government classification system needs to be addressed, because that's why you're also losing many of your good teachers and they're becoming bad administrators, and you're losing good public technical officers and they're becoming not so good administrators, because we're not paying them what they are supposed to be getting. I am all for paying a technical officer as much as you're paying a permanent secretary, if that technical officer is adding value to the ministry. Don't put the permanent secretary at the apex and say because that PS is a PS. Very often the technical officers have much more training, spent a lot more time in the field than the permanent secretary. This is no knock on any permanent secretary. There might be some in the room, but those permanent secretaries, particularly those that go through the administrative route, have a lot less training and a lot less experience than your technical officers. But your technical officers have a glass ceiling. They will never go any further than that. So what they have to do is slide out of the technical stream and become administrators, and you lose very good technical people to administration. So we have to find a way to reward our technical officers so that they can stay in the technical field. The same way we have to find a way to reward our good math and English teachers so that they remain good math and English teachers and don't become deputy principals and principals. Otherwise, we will continue. You talk about an external brain drain, but you also have an internal brain drain by the stupid, antiquated classification system that we have running in the public service. It doesn't work, but like everything else, we don't want to change. We like to talk about things, but not act on them.
Yeah, well, it's a continued disappointment that over the years there hasn't been the marrying and the integration of the use of biodiversity in the educational system, in the health system, in terms of, and I hoped my friend Laura would have mentioned much more when he spoke of the economy of ethnobotany, the economy of biodiversity. Because, we have a lot of talk. You have all these lectures. But in terms of action, something tangible. Because we have so much in biodiversity, we have so much in raw materials, which we should be looking to utilize, to utilize for our benefit. But over the years, so many years, it's not happening. Everybody's doing a little something here and there. Anthea is doing her paper, I'm doing my herbs, this other one is doing this, and there isn't the integration and the marrying and the assistance. Not enough assistance from those that should be assisting, coordinating and making it happen. You hear of all these incubator projects where, the small businesses can get together in units to be properly managed, to, get manufacturing and get products out to the people. Because at the end of the day, you talk, and it's good to have the theory, but at the end of the day, you need, finished products. You need finished products to feed your people, for the health, utilization, and, the tourist industry, even our craft. There's so many things that, our biodiversity should be targeted towards to make it tangible and to make it beneficial for our everyday life, our whole economy, local use, and export. So I'm still disappointed, but I'm still here. And one day, it might occur that we have the integration and the marrying and the, really help to those who want to do things and have the passion and the capability.
I can't disagree with anything you've said. I think also that it's a question of misplaced priorities, the lack of an evidence-based approach to things. I did a presentation recently where I was looking at how governments in particular prioritize their interventions. And in 1992, St. Lucia exported 120,000 tons of bananas to the UK, and we brought in $200 million worth of foreign exchange. We then got fixated on that. And whilst the entire external environment for bananas changed and the WTO came in and we lost the preferential treatment, we continue to pump money in bananas. So there's a graph that shows $200 million, 120,000 tons in 1992, to $0 and 0 tons in 2019. But in that same period, governments pumped in over $222 million worth of support into the banana industry. So as banana revenue and output was going this way, government support to bananas was going that way, because we were wedded to this idea of bananas and that we must pump money to bananas because of the social and political importance of bananas, not understanding that there's a whole ecosystem that is much bigger than bananas. And you looked at one of the slides I put up there from the Body Shop, showed endless products from bananas that are selling for much more than that one little finger of bananas will sell at Waitrose or at Marks and Spencer in the UK. So I agree with you 100%, Gilbertha. That's what this whole thing about, from agreement to action. But that's where the public education comes in. And that's why I said in my talk, the very first set of people we have to educate are the policymakers at the public and private sectors, because they're the ones who are pushing us in a particular direction, and we are powerless to move in the direction that we all know that we should be moving. Anita was good at making people win, so I'll make us win, say again. Every single government has believed that the 15 people who sit in a cabinet are the brain trusts of the country, that nobody is more intelligent than the 15 people who sit in a cabinet, and that these people can make all the decisions that are in the best interest of the people. Whereas you have another 175,000 people out there who are much more qualified, much more experienced, and have a much wider range of knowledge than they. So this whole question of community engagement and finding out what people need does not happen, because once somebody passes a popularity contest on election day, that person is omnipotent, omniscient, and all the other omnis you could think of.
Thank you again, Dr. Fletcher. And at this time, we want to remember Miss Anita James, of course, the reason why we are gathered here on International Biodiversity Day. And there's a short 3-minute video, which we're going to be showing you at this time, which, of course, will remember Anita.
Mentor, teacher, friend, colleague, conservationist, champion. When we think of Miss Anita James, these are but a few of the ways that we remember her. As a scholar, she earned a bachelor's degree in chemistry with a minor in biology from the Cave Hill campus, University of the West Indies in 1983. From 1983 to 1984, she was the chemistry tutor at the Division of Arts, Science and General Studies at Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. From 1984 to 1990, she served as chemistry and biology CXC teacher at the Suffolk Comprehensive Secondary School, where she headed the science department. She insisted that her students work with Mr. Laurent Japierre, ethnobotanist of the St. Lucia National Trust, to gain knowledge from their aged relatives of the local medicinal herbs used for some common illnesses. From that, a medicinal herb garden was produced on the school compound to display these herbs. The students went on to participate in science fairs and won prizes to represent St. Lucia at a regional science fair in Jamaica and international science fair in Chicago. It was in 1990 that she joined the forestry department as the environmental education officer, having worked on environmental education projects with her students at the Suffolk Comprehensive Secondary School. Miss James was instrumental in spearheading annual teacher training workshops through a program funded by the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States and the Canadian International Development Agency. Over a 5-year period, about 150 teachers were trained until funding ran out. The teachers would form environmental groups after each workshop to encourage each other in their environmental conservation endeavors. Ms. James led the consolidation of the conservation education campaign for Jacko, the national bird, and the forests, and used a similar methodology to educate citizens on the conservation of the St. Lucia whiptail and other reptiles. During her stint as an environmental education officer, she saw to the development and establishment of 11 trails in the government forest reserve to encourage forest conservation and appreciation by locals, school children, and visitors alike. She served as officer in charge of the Environment Department in 1999, where she worked with the then Caribbean Environmental Health Unit to host the first annual tribute to the father of conservation, Mr. Gabriel Coco Charles. She served on the National Climate Change Committee for several years and helped develop St. Lucia's national adaptation policy. She also worked on the Sustainable Energy Plan for the country. Ms. James served as the biosafety coordinator, overseeing a project that helped St. Lucia to get on par with the needs for the biosafety protocol of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which would ultimately protect the island from the harmful effects of genetically modified organisms. A biosafety bill was drafted through collaboration with various stakeholders. Several persons were trained in biosafety management, and the Biosafety Clearinghouse, an information portal for countries and their GMO activities, was explained to several stakeholders, and training was carried out in the use of the clearinghouse. 2 scientists from the country got trained to the master's level in biosafety. She finished her tenure with government as the biodiversity coordinator, where she promoted biodiversity conservation through the mass media and with various stakeholders, including schools. Through her efforts, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the ministry and the Center for Food Security and Entrepreneurship to help St. Lucia benefit from the sustainable use of its biological resources. Through her efforts, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the ministry and the Center for Food Security and Entrepreneurship to help St. Lucia benefit from the sustainable use of its biological resources. She also represented the country and region in the negotiations for the development of the Nagoya Protocol for Access and Benefit Sharing of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was an area that was dear to her. She helped in the development and establishment of a sustainable financing mechanism for biodiversity conservation locally, the St. Lucia National Conservation Trust Fund. She also served on the local World Heritage Site Committee that successfully submitted St. Lucia's dossier seeking World Heritage Site status for St. Lucia in 2004. Additionally, she would have led the charge of hosting a school's art competition and prize-giving ceremony in that regard. This amazing lady served as a member of the National Steering Committee for the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program from 2015 to 2021, where community-based groups were encouraged and funded to manage environmental features in their localities. In 2022, Ms. James was recognized as a long-serving, well-respected, and dedicated female leader and supporter of science in various capacities in St. Lucia. Her commitment to ensuring the greater appreciation for and understanding of science in St. Lucia was admired. She made it her duty to encourage students and work colleagues to apply themselves in various fields of science and applauded and endorsed them like they were her own children. She was a no-nonsense, tell-it-like-it-is individual whom we respected, even if we didn't always agree with her, and that was rare. On May 24th, in our hearts, we say, Happy Heavenly Birthday, Anita.
And at this time, I'd like to actually invite the representative of the James family, Mrs. Ezra Charlemagne, forward, because we've got a small presentation to make. And of course, I'm not sure exactly where the cameras would want to position you, but you can just orient yourself around Jomo's exhibition there. And of course, to make the presentation to Mrs. Charlemagne, I'd like to invite former Permanent Secretary in the Department of Sustainable Development, Ms. Caroline Eugene, to present the plaque.
Thank you. I would like to present to you a small token of everyone's appreciation. And I say everyone as in persons who have worked with her, persons who have benefited from all what she has offered us. This small token is in no way a representation of the love that we have and had for her, the compassion, the dedication that she showed in everything that she did. I know I miss her. I know the first thing she did was call me incorrigible, and we became friends. Yes, I know that she served as a role model for many of us seated here. When I left Sustainable, I thought that was the last of it, because Anita is about environment and about sustainable development. No, it wasn't so. I got a call frantically one day saying, Caroline, what y'all doing for Laverne Spencer? I mean, Anita, this is sports. I've left environment, I'm in sports. But that showed you how, no matter where you went, she was always there, supportive of everything that you do. And I know I learned a lot, and a lot of us in that room can say the very same, that Anita was a darling. She was loved beyond a shadow of a doubt. I will always remember her on the 24th, because we always celebrated as much as we can, because mine is the 26th of May. So we always made it our duty for us to celebrate together. And one of the photos there would have been the last of the birthdays before COVID came and interrupted our flow. Therefore, I'm telling you, I miss her, and I know a lot of us do miss her. This, as I said, is a small, just small. And if I have my way, and a lot of us have our way, the building at Forestry, parts of it, we're not taking it away from Mr. Charles, but we want something more tangible for Anita's name to be placed on. Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for being here tonight with us, and to, of course, share this wonderful evening, the inaugural Anita James Memorial Lecture in, of course, commemoration of International Biodiversity Day.